hope you are enjoying this year's 23rd RRI International Conference on Dialysis and Advances in Kidney Disease. The RRI conference continues thriving by providing the latest developments in therapy options for the nephrology community worldwide.
Our hope is that you thrive with us, with the creative and valuable online networking opportunities such as poster sessions and industry symposiums.
Part of our mission is to foster relationships and collaborations that will not otherwise be accessible offline.
Poster sessions, resources, and industry symposiums will remain available until August 1st, 2021, including the chat feature.
Networking sessions provide a powerful opportunity to develop fruitful, long-lasting, and professional relationships towards meaningful collaborations with industry thought leaders, medical professionals, researchers, and scholars.
Visit other online sessions, engage virtually with industry leaders and partners, and explore all the showcase material and information. Be curious. I wish you a wonderful rest of the conference and hand now over to Dr. Amy Waterman for the live Q&A with Drs. Carmine Zoccali, Flor Alvarado, Cynthia Delgado, Alan Kliger, and Kenneth Prager.
Good morning to everyone who's here. I want to welcome you to the live question and answer session with some amazing presenters. And I want to say welcome on behalf of myself. I'm a UCLA professor in nephrology. I work on equal access to transplant for all patients, and I work in partnership with dialysis communities. So I'm really honored to lead this session and to really kick off a great interactive time with us. Now, I want you all to know I think we all wish we could see each other in person, but for now, the way that we can talk to each other is through the chat. So what I wanted to do is if people could just let us know, could you guys kick us off, our chat participants who are listening, and just tell us what state you're in right now? Just type in a state for us and say, hey, we're representing, like I'm representing from California. Where are you representing from? If we could kind of get the chat going a little bit, because this is how we're going to talk to one another. So I'd love to see who's listening right now. And ooh, Tennessee, grew up in Tennessee, my Tennessee person. So all right, I can see, this makes me really excited because sometimes you feel like you're talking to yourself in this world. So I want to let you know, look at all the people that are making the time to help patients now from across the country. This is amazing. So thank you guys for being here to listen to us. And our panel's going to get it started. And I want to just say, for the sake of all of us, that the talks that we're going to talk about today are available in the on-demand program. So if any of these excite you, please make sure before the end of the conference that you have a sense, a chat to sit down and to really watch and listen and enjoy the full story. But I'd love right now for our panelists to introduce themselves. So maybe we could start with Dr. Kliger.
Hi, I'm Alan Kliger. I'm a clinical professor of medicine at Yale in New Haven, Connecticut. I chair ASN's Nephrologists Transforming Dialysis Safety, which is a joint effort with the CDC to target zero infections among dialysis patients. And in this last year, I've co-chaired ASN's COVID-19 response team. And so my talk had to do with COVID-19 and where it's been, and I'm hoping now to talk about where we are.
Thank you. Dr. Prager.
Sorry about that. My name is Kenneth Prager. I'm professor of medicine at Columbia University Medical Center. I'm also the director of clinical ethics and in charge of the ethics consultations that we do on inpatients and outpatients. And I chair the medical ethics committee. And obviously during the COVID pandemic, the demand and the request for ethics consultation really ballooned. And we had many, many ethical conundrums, as you can imagine. And my talk is entitled Ethical Challenges Posed by COVID-19 in the ICU.
Thank you, Dr. Prager. Dr. Alvarado.
Yes, hi, good morning, everyone. And let me just say it's a very humbling experience to be in this panel of such, stellar investigators and just rock stars in the field. But I'm Flor Alvarado, as I mentioned. I'm a third-year nephrology fellow at Johns Hopkins University, and I'm the immediate former intern of the ASN's Diversity and Inclusion Committee, the intern for that committee, and it's just been a great experience to get involved with various research endeavors related to mitigating health disparities that affect our patients with chronic kidney disease. And so I'd invite you all to also look at our talk for myself and Dr. Delgado, entitled The Systemic and Cultural Barriers to Patient Care. Thank you.
Wonderful. Welcome. So happy to have you. This is how you do it. You just get on a panel and then you become a rock star pretty fast. So, all right. And then Dr. Delgado.
Hi, I'm Dr. Cynthia Delgado. I am an associate professor at the San Francisco Veterans Affairs Medical Center and at the University of California at San Francisco. I currently serve as the chair of the Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Committee for the American Society of Nephrology, and I also currently co-chair the task force to reassess race in the inclusion of estimating equations.
Great. So very important talks, all of them. Okay, so I'd like to maybe start with Dr. Delgado and Alvarado and then go outwards into like the COVID challenges in general. I think this is really a discussion about all of the challenges that our patients are facing, right, in many different levels. So let's just kind of start with you. So I want to just ask both of you who'd ever like to speak, what biases and barriers should the people listening be aware of that might be affecting our care of dialysis patients?
Well, I think that's a great question, and I think that's one of the points that we make in our talk as well. Is we all have to start where we are and recognize that there are implicit and explicit biases in our own selves. We have not grown up with the same context as our patients, and just having that at the forefront as we provide care, and that provides us with an open-mindedness, I think, to ask questions that we wouldn't otherwise, that might provide better care down the road. So I think that's what I would start with. And
then, did you want to add anything, Dr. Delgado?
Well, particularly in this year, with all of the social unrest that we've all witnessed, and the issues related to COVID-19 that you'll get to later, there have been some greater issues related to housing insecurity, food insecurity, and so really it's a call for us. I'm really happy that we are presenting this information this year, because it's really the right time to start thinking about the patient from not just from the nephrology perspective, but from the perspective of the whole and what they bring into the dialysis unit when they sit in their chairs. And so having that perspective about what's actually affecting the patient on the out in the community as they bring it in with them I think will help encourage a stronger patient provider relationship.
I agree. I was thinking, we've been talking a lot at UCLA. When we're all very packed together, right? It's Los Angeles, and we were talking about the size of the apartments and the fact that you can't social distance, you can't get away from people that in your family who might be facing this, and also the fact that some of our lower income patients are not able to stay home, right? And how does that then impact their health? If they're kidney patients, are you seeing that, or that was an example that we're seeing in LA?
Yes, for many groups.
Know, do you have other examples?
Yeah, for many groups,
other examples like that.
I could bring up the issue. Sorry.
Go ahead, Dr. Prager.
Yes, well, I was going to bring up potential biases in the acute setting that we experienced. As you may know, New York City was the epicenter of the COVID pandemic at the very beginning, back in March and April of 2020. And in contrast to a shortage of ventilators, which we did not experience, we experienced a shortage of dialysis machines and of dialysate. And so the issue was in the ICUs that we had, during that surge, what do you do? How do you triage when you have limited sources and an unlimited demand. And the issue of biases could definitely enter there. If would age play a factor? Would there be a bias against somebody who's older but may be healthier than somebody who's younger? What about the issue of disabilities? Somebody who comes in with either mental or physical disabilities who needs dialysis, and you are short in terms of your machines and your dialysate. So definitely the issue of bias there, potential bias, was a very acute one and a life and death, not in sort of a large holistic approach. We had to make decisions on the spot. And so that was a very critical issue, and there were ethical consults called in certain circumstances like that.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I couldn't agree more with Dr. Prager. I mean, honestly, Dr. Waterman, you might know this, but the VA actually had to shore up its lines. And so I was actually the supply chain for Los Angeles.
Wow.
And so, yes. And so how could you, making that decision of how much supply to give for, renal replacement therapy and the solutions versus what you need for your own, it was really a challenge to make sure that we didn't introduce bias in our decision-making to service all of our patients.
I'm always a lot of caring people wanting to do the right thing. What were you kind of being responsible for? You know what I mean? So that the bias wasn't there. Like, what was affecting how you would make decisions on scarce resources?
Well, that's, each case was individual. I think that we did not have, it's not as if, I often say that many of these ethical decisions, it's not as if you have an equation, you put in the variables and out pops the answer. It's much more complicated than that. And really, I would say it's a case-by-case basis. Our underlying principle was a utilitarian one. We wanted to do the most good for the most number of people. And so we would look at the clinical circumstances surround the individual. We would, the issue of disability would not impact unless it had a significant impact on the likelihood of survival of that patient during that hospitalization. Otherwise, it should not affect. And similarly with age, unless there was a clear-cut correlation between age and the unlikelihood of survival, age per se was not considered to be an issue. So these were wrenching types of decisions. And I must say, and then again, there was the whole issue of if you have dialysate and it's limited, would you rather give half-baked dialysis for 2 people or whole dialysis for 1 person, and the other person will suffer and perhaps die? And so these were ongoing. I wish I could have for you a formula so that everybody can use it and pop in the right answer. It doesn't work that way. They're agonizing decisions. We try to do the best for the most people.
So, sorry, go ahead.
Let me tell you what happened on the institutional level. In the beginning of April, 2 of the New York hospitals called us at the ASN and said, we're really concerned because our suppliers are telling us that they can't increase the volume of dialysate to send to us. And they're saying that because everyone is clamoring for dialysate around the country, and the hotspot is New York, but everybody wants to be prepared for their own hotspot. So we really can't do that. And what we did was really interesting. We first collected data from all of the New York hospitals that had increased their ICU beds by nearly 3,000 beds in the city. And we collected data on where dialysis fluid was lacking and what the next week or the next 2 weeks would likely look like. And we then helped bring the manufacturers together with the large hospital organizations in New York to figure out how best to accommodate the sudden huge surge in need. And in fact, one of the ways that this was solved was that the nephrology community and patients were remarkably creative. That is, they did do the continuous therapies discontinuously and shared it among several patients that were judged to be able to have that. Acute peritoneal dialysis was used in several institutions for care. Long tubing was introduced so that staff could be outside of the rooms to protect themselves as dialysis was performed. So that the nephrology community responded with tremendous creativity and worked collaboratively with the manufacturers to assure that enough dialysate indeed was delivered, and that, Ken, your dilemmas were limited by a huge effort to make sure that enough dialysis was there.
Thank you.
That's great. Let me ask the people that are listening in, what were you all doing that were solution based? Like listening to some of these, what were the challenges you were facing? Put them in the chat. What were the solutions that you dealt with in the immediate? Dr. Zoccali, can you hear me? I'm not sure if he can hear us, unfortunately.
Dr. Zoccali, can you hear us?
Dr. Zoccali, can you hear us right now?
I was right, since I've seen a question written, and I was right.
I know, I wanted to let you speak.
I can tell you.
You can answer it, yeah. Share the Italy experience for us.
The Italian experience. As you may know, the epidemic exploded in Lombardy. Lombardy is the region of Milan, one of the richest region, I must say, the richest region of the country. And I remember during the first wave of the epidemic, my colleague in Milan being overburdened with requests for acute treatment, with the moral and emotional burden of families and other doctors dying. Many Italian doctors died during the pandemic. It was calculated that more than 200 doctors died, which is not a small number at all. I don't know if nephrologists died during the epidemic. The emotional burden is still there because the second wave hit also the southern part of Italy, which was spared during the first wave.
Yeah,
enormous moral burden.
Yes, yes.
As you know, Italy is the country with the highest number of dead people in Europe.
Wow.
And one with the highest burden on a world scale.
I'm so sorry. And I think that it's important what you said, that the stress on our providers, the loss of life of providers is something that sometimes it's like we're talking about the patients and their families. We're not talking about the impact of the COVID and the never-endingness of COVID on the providers listening, on all of us, and then the fact that our colleagues have been affected too. Dr. Prager, you talked about this in your talk. Do you want to talk about the stress that you saw at New York? Oh, you're mute.
Sorry, I'm going to just stay unmuted. Well, yeah, during the surge in New York, the doctors had never experienced anything like this. This was a life-transforming experience for the young doctors, for the older doctors. Many of the older doctors did not come in because of the risk and so forth. So this was something was unanticipated. You know, you read about this in medical school about pandemics and this, but you say, no, this is never going to happen to me. Well, it happened. It happened, and it happened on a massive scale. So on the one hand, there was the moral distress of having so many patients who died that you could not help. You were surrounded by death. Number two, there was the distress of not having the families being able to be with the patients when they died. Very often patients need their families. They are the advocates. They are there from every minute. And so very often the physicians would have to serve as the go-between using videos from a cell phone so that the families could say goodbye to their loved one. Then there was the moral distress of what do I do in a situation like this when I have 8 people in the emergency department on ventilators? The emergency department is not meant to have this, and I don't have any room in the ICUs, et cetera. And what do you do also when physicians feel that they are not able to provide optimal treatment because of the sheer massive numbers. The nurses, normally in an ICU, the ratio is 1 nurse for 2 patients. They had to go up to 1 nurse for 4 patients. And that was an incredible distress. And really what happened, actually, one of our physicians who was the head of the emergency department at Allen Pavilion committed suicide. This was a young physician in her 40s with no history of mental illness who got COVID herself, and she committed suicide. And it was a horrendous shock, adding to all of the distress. But I think it was kind of exemplified the degree to which people suffered. Also, they had to go home to their families. They were worried that they would transmit this to their kids. Some of them didn't even go home because they were worried about transmitting, et cetera, et cetera. I will say, and I addressed the House staff and so forth, Winston Churchill said of the British people during the air raids when the Nazis bombed London, he said that the bravery of the British, this was their finest hour, and also talking about the Royal Air Force. And I used that term for the House staff and for the physicians at Columbia. I said, this was your finest hour.
That's great. I wanted to say something. So I'm a psychologist. So I've talked a lot to the psychologist and social work community about what we're doing to try to support mental health. And the biggest discovery I had, and we've all talked about it, is that normally when there's a need, a health need, the idea is that the providers are stronger. The healthcare professionals are balanced, centered, their lives work, and then they can provide reassurance, support, resources to a patient in need, right? Same with doctors. Their own lives are hopefully functional, and then they can provide excellence in care. In the case of this stressor affecting everybody on the planet, the people who are supposed to be the strong are facing this in their own way. And we were just talking about how does the mental health community provide support when they themselves are not at their best, facing challenges as well, as this need is so heavy. Dr. Kliger, do you have any thoughts, or Dr. Zoccali?
Well, I'd like to add a perspective. At that first wave, when New York was just buried by need and by sick people and needy staff, we tried to figure out what lessons we could share that other places around the country and around the world might learn from, so that we might be better prepared for a similar onslaught. And what we found was really interesting, which is that the anatomy of the pandemic appeared to change with time. And that in the second wave in the Midwest, and then in California, and most recently in January and December, that the face of what actually we've seen in hospitals is really different than it was back in New York in March and April, in that, number one, ICU occupancy is far less than it was as a % of patients admitted. And second of all, the incidence of acute kidney injury that required renal replacement therapy is really way down compared to where it was. And so that the shortages of fluid, for example, the need for extra dialysis equipment, the need to make decisions about who would get acute care with a CRRT machine and who would not, all of that became vanishingly rare as the time went along. And the challenge became more one of dealing in a more traditional urgency than the onslaught and emergency that was seen in not only New York, but in Chicago and in tech parts of Texas and in other cities in the first wave. So for whatever reason, it really appeared to change, and many of the lessons that we try to put together were no longer particularly relevant, although the ongoing effects of tremendous stress and of the long haulers, or the long effects, are really now becoming a much more prominent problem.
Yes, I want to ask actually about. Oh, go ahead, Dr.
I was just going to say, in San Francisco, there, like Dr. Kliger said, these occurrences happened in waves in different places. One thing that I did notice was that we as nephrologists started reassuring one another from across state lines and even across internationally. So, you know, we were communicating with our colleagues in Italy when they were having their onslaught, and we were reassuring them and trying to find ways to, you know, to find commonality and support one another because of the setting of mental health fatigue, right?
Mm-hmm.
When you typically, healthcare professionals are very strong because they can go home to their resource, right? They go home to their source. But during this time, you had to worry about your own family, your own area of family comfort zone, and worry about the comfort zone of the hospital and the patients you cared for. So it was an extra strain. But I do want to say that we were using social media, text messaging one another, reassuring one another. Some folks were even mailing supplies to other friends in other states to help them along. And I think that was one really beautiful show of, as Dr. Prager said, our finest hour.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well,
Dr.
I think this
Zoccali wanted to say something. Dr.
Great. Thank you. Go ahead.
Yeah, intervene?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Welcome.
Yeah, I would be very interested in knowing how the vaccination program was run in dialysis patients in America. Was it started very early, or dialysis patients were initially excluded from the vaccination program? At what stage is the vaccination program? Which proportion of the dialysis population has already been vaccinated?
Yeah.
All dialysis patients or part of them?
Mm-hmm. Yep. Go ahead, Dr. Kliger.
Yeah, so it's a great question, Carmine. Let me tell you what actually happened in the US. First of all, in the early stages when vaccine was available, December, January into February, every location, every state, and sometimes different cities in different states in the US had different ways of handling the distribution. And so there were some places where dialysis patients were given priority, and there was actually some vaccine that was delivered directly to facilities. In other states, like where I live in Connecticut, there was no priority given, and it was only age that was used as a criteria to distribute the vaccine. Then about 1 month ago, our CDC and the White House gave, after several organizations, including the ASN, had done a lot of lobbying work, gave a special distribution available to all dialysis facilities through the two large dialysis companies, but through those companies to all companies in the US, so that now all dialysis patients, independent of any other issues, do have access of direct vaccination in the dialysis facilities for all patients.
Mm-hmm. I also know there's an issue with vaccine. Is there enough vaccine, right? So in the US, we're having, it seems like, and correct me if I'm wrong, but that we have enough vaccine now. But the other part is, I'm speaking on the transplant side. You also have people who are transplant recipients who we're seeing, if they get COVID, they do more poorly in terms of recovering. So the key that we're seeing is both, do you have access to enough vaccine in your state, in your country? And then second, are people willing to take it? And we're seeing there's a message of vaccine hesitancy that's coming up. For some of our vulnerable populations, and for stubborn people in general that have a belief that I'm not trying to debate. But so I wondered if you all wanted to say anything about the vaccine hesitancy that we're seeing for the dialysis and transplant communities.
So just one quick word, and we're actually putting some data together that I'm hoping that we'll be able to publish. But the early data look like this, that among dialysis patients, there surely was so-called hesitancy ranging from different locations from about 10% to about 40%. Once vaccines were actually directly available in dialysis facilities, administered by the nurses that the patients trusted and recommended by the doctors that the patients knew and trusted, and where patients could talk to each other about the vaccines, that hesitancy number went way down. And the large dialysis companies now are reporting informally, as we collect the data, somewhere around 80% of patients have been accepting, and in some locations up to 90% have been accepting. So getting that direct load to the dialysis facilities has made a real difference.
That's great. I'm glad to hear it. Other things, Dr. Prager, do you want to share something?
If you don't mind, I'd like to just revert back to lessons learned from the crisis.
Absolutely.
We have limited time. There are 3 lessons that I'd like to put out there. Number one, I think that we, if any positive thing came out of the crunch last spring, it is to see the disproportionate effect of COVID on disadvantaged populations. And hopefully, if anything positive will come out of this, will be to address the inequities in healthcare that led to predisposing conditions that resulted in inordinate amount of mortality, obesity, hypertension, diabetes, etc. So I think that this really focused, whether we will just forget about this as COVID wanes, hopefully not, hopefully we won't forget about it, but I think that that really focused laser-like on why is it that these communities are so disadvantaged in terms of their underlying predispositions. Lesson number two, and that is, at least in New York State, and the laws will vary across the country, but there was a great deal of moral distress by physicians when families insisted on continuing aggressive treatment when the situation was hopeless. And so when you had a shortage of ICU beds and ICU people, to have beds occupied by people whose dying process was being prolonged because of inappropriate aggressiveness of treatment, it raised the question of medical futility, and should physicians be allowed to have greater autonomy in circumstances such as this, especially when there was a shortage of facilities. And that's number two. And number three is the issue of preparedness. We were so totally unprepared in terms of PPE and other things. Hopefully that lesson will not be lost. I mean, people were using their N95 mask for 1 week, for 2 weeks, and so forth. It was awful. I don't have to tell you how there were even some people who were fired from the hospitals because they brought this up to the press and so on and so forth. So the issue of preparedness, I would hope, is another lesson that we can take away from this COVID pandemic.
Yeah, I wondered if Dr. Delgado or Dr. Alvarado would like to add anything about what you see kind of in terms of the new focus on we have a major problem here, and this is just highlighted, the COVID has highlighted it. What do you see in terms of initiatives? Do you think that things are going to change? Do you think that we can use this as a moment of change?
No, absolutely. And actually, thank you for directing the question. I think that Dr. Prager brought up a great point, which is there has to be this focus on health inequities moving forward. And, so even up until this point, folks have already done the job of highlighting, where some of these gaps lie. And so moving forward, it's the why, it's the how we're going to fill in these gaps. And it'll be through a collaborative process. It'll be through community engagement and knowing that each community is slightly different. There is not one size fits all. And so being able to do the work at local levels, in addition to regional, national levels, is going to be very important. And Dr. Kliger brought up the example of vaccines and how when there is that trust in how the process is being carried out, it really changes how our patients are able to take that in and how they respond to the interventions that we put forth. So I think moving forward, I think we've certainly highlighted the need of engaging stakeholders in the communities and recognize that it'll be different from one community to another. I think that's one of the main take homes that I've taken.
I will say that the American Society of Nephrology and National Kidney Foundation have really taken this opening as an opportunity for change. This year, the National Kidney Foundation began the Health Equity Advisory Committee to do the work of figuring out why these disparities exist and what we can do to address them. In addition, the American Society of Nephrology, apart from the Diversity and Inclusion Committee, which is really more focused on the inward disparities with regards to our workforce, has also started another committee that's called the Healthcare Justice Committee, that's charged with looking at health disparities and working across the aisle with other specialty care and medicine care societies to help address and correct where they can these disparities and really bring them to light. Because I do agree with Dr. Prager and Kliger, this really was an opening and truly highlighted the amount of disparity in terms of healthcare and maybe even that sometimes healthcare delivery.
So if I could say something I learned from both of your presentation, I felt you discussed a lot of screening tools that the audience might want to look at, that you can screen for levels of homelessness, food insecurity, safety in the home, those kind of things. I could really see that those are things you sometimes get hints at as you provide care for patients. But what I was left with was there could be more screening happening at our different healthcare facilities to look for these challenges. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, it really speaks to the fact that we have traditionally looked at medicine through a very narrow lens. And it's become so clear that if we're truly going to be patient-focused, that's too narrow a lens, that the screening you're talking about has to do with being aware and being proactive with things like food security, shelter, community involvement. It's a much wider challenge that we have if we're going to truly be patient-centered.
Yes, I agree fully.
Dr. Kliger just took the words right out of my mouth.
Yes, I think it's great. It's the broader, they talk about a multi-level approach to changing and improving care. And they talk about there's the patient at the center, their family, the system that they're part of, the community at large, and then the policies that are affecting them. And I think this is a moment to go a little bit more broadly in our thinking and look at how all of these fit together. And research has shown that when you have an approach that's touching multiple parts of this onion that I'm sharing, that the care of patients will be improved, their longevity will be there. And I think that's kind of the eye-opening thing that, no one can avoid anymore. So that's, my share on that. Okay, great. I'm sorry.
Quickly, the point is you can do that practically at the patient's chair side.
Yes.
So, when I make my rounds, or any of us do, when we talk to our patients, we're now not only talking about, what their phosphorus balance is and what their diet is like, which is traditionally what we've done, but also about things like their food chain and security and what's happening with the families, and who's immunized and who's not immunized, and are they secure at home, so that you can bring these things practically right at the chair side to patients as we think about their care.
Yes.
Part of the problem.
Okay, wait, hold on. Yeah, go ahead, Dr. Prager. No, you're good. Part
of the problem is we don't incentivize general internal medicine. We pay a lot of money if you're a specialist, cardiologist, et cetera. But the people who really, family medicine, general internal medicine, and so forth, financially, it's not remunerated. People don't go into it. It's not an attractive field, they feel. And that's where preventive medicine, that's where the most good can happen, frankly. And we, as a society, we're not committed to this.
Dr. Delgado?
I was just going to say, at the same time that we find the value in administering the KDQOL in our dialysis units to make sure that our patients have good quality of life, and we're required to keep surveillance on that, it's not that hard to add on these other metrics to make sure that other things such as housing and food security is also a priority for our patients on dialysis.
Yes, it's almost like we all have to have more of a social worker lens, no matter where we're providing care. Do you know what I mean? And to take that on and not say, well, that's the social worker to figure out. It's like, okay, what are we all discovering that in our dialogue and in our review that can help? That's great. So looking at our last couple of minutes, we have patients now who've been dealing with this for a year plus, right? We're heading into a year plus. What do we think the takeaway is of how we can be the best care providers wherever we're providing care as COVID continues and as as we move forward in terms of being more sensitive to what we're facing. And I'd like each panelist to give like a little brief share on that, if you wouldn't mind. So Dr. Delgado, would you be willing to start?
Sure. I think this has been a real opening for us to strengthen our relationship with our patients and be have more of a holistic approach to our care delivery. I think that's one of the biggest lessons from this year, and I hope that we'll carry that moving forward in our practice. So I think that's really the biggest message for me.
Mm-hmm. Great. Dr. Alvarado?
I think what Dr. Delgado said, she kind of hit it on the nail there, but we can't solve these problems alone, essentially, is what a big takeaway is, that there needs to be collaboration at multiple levels. I liked how you mentioned there needs to be this inner talk of the multiple layers of the onion for real change to happen. And it can happen. It doesn't take a crisis such as a pandemic to bring us together. And frankly, a lot of these health issues that are affecting our patients, it has been an ongoing crisis, and we should kind of think of it as such. So I think with collaboration and community, we can do that.
That's great. Thank you. Dr. Zoccali?
I was saying that the Italian health system is much different from the American one. You know that. Italy is like Great Britain and Canada. The health system is unified. It's directly run almost entirely by the government. But I do agree that collaboration of community people, doctors, families should be enhanced as much as possible.
Mm-hmm. Great. And then Dr. Prager?
No, I'm just going to repeat what people have said. I think, the lesson for me is that there are big problems here that have to be addressed on a societal level. Not the individual doctor, you can have only so much influence on your own patients, but to really make a dent in this problem, inequities of healthcare, et cetera, looking at holistic, there has to be an incentivization, first of all, within medicine. We have to value this. We don't value it enough. We value very high technical procedures, and at Columbia Presbyterian Medical Center, our saying is amazing things are happening here. Well, it's time that the amazing things that happen here should be not only heart transplants and multi-organ transplants, but we are providing outstanding care, general care, for a large number of people. That's amazing. That's really going to save lives.
Great. Dr. Kliger, you want to wind us up?
We only have another 10 seconds. And to add to what everyone said, to me, the real lesson is the partnership that we have with our patients, that the patients are the ones in charge. We're helping them to make decisions. And this pandemic has highlighted the fact that that is our best role.
It's great. I want to thank everybody who's attending, and I want to thank you for the care you have of these patients wherever you're providing it, the stress you've faced, and the kind of courage we have to continue to do our best. Thank you so much for attending our live Q&A today.